Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a YouTube channel or a podcast feed that you are listening to. The voice you're hearing is me, Mike Hutchinson, a games designer, and the voice you will soon to be hearing is Glenn Ford. He's also a games designer. We are here on this podcast talking about designing better miniatures games. And what I have done recently is played some miniature games. Unsurprisingly, I like playing miniature games, and I've played quite a few new ones recently, which is nice. And I wanted to chat about another one of the miniature games that I had played for the first time just a couple of weeks ago, and just chew on one particular thing that I found very interesting in it. And from thence, no doubt we will have design ideas, and I will get more ideas for games and run off and change things that I'm already working on. So the game that I played was a what do you call it? It's like a Flash Gordon sort of 30s science fiction. What do you call that? Like Rocket Age kind of a situation.
I think you call that retro sci-fi or
Right. So it's a
retro
Ray Guns and
retrofuturism. It's
retro. Oh,
retrofuturism, I think is what that is.
nice. Okay, so that's the sort of genre conceit we are dealing with here. And the game was called War Rocket. If you are doing retrofuturism, you ought to put the word rocket in somewhere, or the word ray gun, but preferably the word rocket. And it's a spaceship battling game with a lovely set of model spaceships that you can buy that go along. I think there are four factions, or maybe there are five. Um, and we played a couple of small games of it, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It seemed a little bit light on stuff to do. We didn't play enough of the scenarios, but there's definitely a fun game to be had. It's not super deep, but the miniatures are extremely lovely. But the thing about the rules that I found very interesting was that there are four factions, and each of the factions moves in completely different ways. They have different movement rules. And so there is no general movement phase description in the core rules. That's not a thing. Each faction is defined by having unique movement rules. And so two things that are interesting. One is the having no central movement mechanics and having a range of them. And obviously the other one is making like core rule mechanical differences between your factions, which is something Glenn and I have talked about before in other areas.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
I don't know. No, yeah.
So I will describe, for example, a couple of the movement systems that we dealt with in our games. So one, these ships all have like a speed value, which is essentially the movement points they've got to spend. And there was one where pivoting cost a couple of movement points, but you could only do it once, and you could travel as far as you wanted in a straight line, and then make one pivot at some point. So you could go quite a long way, but you only ever had an ability to pivot once. So you had to travel in an L shape or some acute or obtuse version of that. And the other faction, the one that I was playing, it was very expensive to rotate round. So pivoting was quite expensive, but you could travel in any direction, not just straight forward. So you could sort of sidestep in any way that you wanted. My guys were shaped like little UFOs, so you could do a sort of zigzaggy UFO flight path. And so I had a lot of maneuverability sort of on the what do you call it, like on the XY, but if somebody got round the side of me, like it was quite expensive for me to actually pivot rounds to bring my guns to bear. So whilst I was in control of the situation, I was very flexible. But then and so unfortunately the game itself kind of broke down in the end game to like two sort of chess pieces that couldn't quite catch each other going rounds in circles. But nevertheless, the like central ideas of this game kind of caught my design imagination, and I wanted to chat about them a bit.
Yeah, because that particular version of things is, yeah, the first thing that leaped to my mind is picturing, a bishop on the black squares and another
Mhm.
bishop on the white squares on a chessboard, just going, right, well, this just isn't going anywhere, is it, guys? Let's.
That's the extreme example, yes.
um, and obviously, it's like, so I guess there's sort of the standard groups of movement types we tend to deal with in these games is like the lone character 360-degree go wherever he wants to, kind of point to point sort of
Yeah,
stuff.
the sort of free moving skirmish stuff. Like,
Yeah,
I mean, like a skirmish war game would tend to have that for all of its characters.
yeah, and squads which tend to be the same thing, but a bit of contingency stuff going in there that sort of reduces that, depending on like
Coherency.
yeah, coherency and stuff. The like your block units that have a sort of bit of inertia and can't just like go suddenly in that direction. And then your sort of your templatey movement, which is like not only can you not suddenly go in that direction, you can't go a little bit to here and you can't turn that way because you've got to go, in that direction or whatever. And I think there's sort of gradations of control going on there. And I think it's for me, it the first one is really interesting because I find constraints and controls interesting
Hmm.
both in design and whilst playing a game. I don't want a game to give me too much freedom. I want something to like push against. And so I tend to be sort of interested in games that have like constraints and controls and conditions upon movement phases. Sticking multiple ones of them into the same game, I think it can be interesting but tricky because like when you mentioned this subject before we started recording, the thing that instantly leaped to my mind is what was Warhammer Fantasy Battle, um, and I guess in its new iteration now, the Old World. I don't even know if the Old World has skirmishing. It must have skirmishers. I can't literally remember off the top of my head, but certainly Warhammer Fantasy Battle has block units, and it had skirmishing units that could then move like 360-degree in any direction. And what happened, in the edition where they made skirmishing units a big thing, skirmishing units became wildly like overpowered and hugely dominated, all the tournaments and all the competitive lists because they were sort of playing a different game to those block units. The block units are moving around. The skirmishers just stood next to them, just punching them in the side of the head. Go, what are you guys? What are you guys thinking? Why don't you just turn and guess? I can't turn and get you. I can't turn and get you. I've got to. I've got to wheel. Well, we don't have to. We'll just step backwards slightly and keep punching. This is
Yeah.
brilliant. You guys are fools. And so I do think you have to be like very wary in movement phases because you are controlling like the first point at which your players get to interact with the game. When you monkey around with that, you can very quickly lock people out of the game. It's like whenever I see random movement abilities or randomness in your ability to move in a game, I always get a little bit like, oh, okay, this is going to have to be done pretty well because there's
Right.
nothing worse to me in a game than like, okay, I'm about to move. Am I allowed to move? No, I'm not allowed to move. Okay, okay, great. That's nice. What do I do? Oh, nothing. I do nothing now. Great. Okay, let's move on. It's
Yeah.
like I have to have like I have to at least be able to engage with that movement phase in a way that I understand, in a way that I understand how it interacts with you, how it interacts with the game, how it all fits together. The shooting, the combat can be like random and mad, and I don't know what you're doing. You're shooting me with some sort of hyper laser, but I've got to be allowed to walk from there to there, get to the objective. I think I'm going to get to the combat. I think I want to get to. So it's like it's a really juicy area to muck about with, but it's so high risk. It's the risk is so often where a lot of the power is, in these design elements, and it is one that it's like,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think like a lot of indie games will tend towards describing one kind of object, one kind of thing. Like this is a game about, troopers, this is a game about mechs, this is a game about cars. And that's good. And I think that is, in many cases the right way to go about things. When you try and write a game with lots of different types of units in, so if it's if it's an epic scale army game like Epic 40,000 or Drop Zone Commander, where you've got or Warhammer 40,000, where you've got very different sorts of units. You've got, little infantry units, and you've got giant robot stomping mechs, and you've got aircraft, and like in that situation, I think a lot of games have attempted to find the lowest common denominator and create a movement system that is either abstracted enough or general and non-specific enough that it can kind of apply to everything. But I think that, you know, what War Rockets sort of suggests to me, and actually I've been writing a game that had three different kinds of movement in it a while ago, where, you know, if there are some units that have free movement, some units that have a kind of lumbering, sidestepping, some amount of turning, Adeptus Titanicus kind of a movement thing, and there are some that sort of like this one where you just have to travel in a straight line and then you have to pivot once, which is kind of, yeah, I think of that as like naval movement almost.
Mm.
Um, like you could describe those three kinds of movement relatively simply in a single paragraph each, and then assign them as sort of keywords or something, or as unit traits. And so um, you could then have a relationship between different, you know, different, very different classes of units that felt quite different. And as you say, like there's a risk in that, and you'd have to be cautious about what the interactions between those things. But like the fact that there could be interactions and asymmetries is super interesting.
Yeah, I think like mixing I think mixing movement modes is particularly tricky because it's like I always remember sort of when X-Wing came out, you know, I looked at that rule book and I wondered how it could be so quick
Yeah.
and simple. And a large part of the answer is because of the movement system, it can be incredibly simple because of the templates. And you
And
sort of
because of the almost non-existence of terrain.
yeah, exactly. Movement can be there's no cover, there's no terrain, you know, movement. I don't need to worry about degrees of pivot and, you know, uh, uh, any of those sort
And
of
there's also no close combat. So there's
yeah,
no
yeah.
engagement, there's no like being pinned in combat. You
Whereas like
you get a lot when you yeah, have spaceships flying around. You get a lot of gimmies.
yeah, absolutely. Whereas like I think probably the movement section in Warhammer Fantasy Battle is probably about as lengthy as the entire rule book for X-Wing. And I think like as soon
I
as you
wouldn't be surprised if it was twice the length, to be
it, well,
honest.
yeah, you know exactly, and like once you go, okay, well, I'm now. Here's what how it takes me to explain inertial block movement for units. Now I'm going to put in two or three more different alternative versions of movement, and it's like, okay, there's a lot of work getting through this, and you know, it takes a lot of nerve to go. Okay, look at the movement section. Is that 60 pages? Yes, that's 60 pages. It'll be worth it. Trust me. I've not even got to the shooting people in the face bit. No, and you probably won't do, but you know, crack on with your movement, laddie boy. It's where eat your greens and then you'll get the treats afterwards. It's it's a tricky thing to offer people. That sort of like, yes, there's like difficult to pass in rules terms crunchiness within my movement section is not the fireworks factory of a selling point, you know, to get a game across to people. And it's like, you know, there can be one of those things where it's like, okay, well, once it could be a grower of a game, and once people have played it a few times, go, oh no, it's really good that it's got these different movement things. But until that point, I've you know, it feels like the sort of thing that people avoid doing because it's easy to bounce off of. Would be my guess. I certainly is why I would bulk at doing it.
Mm.
But then equally, I think I default to point movement at the moment because there are different things about movement I find interesting than how you physically move your minis in many ways.
The pathfinding part of it is not interesting at the moment to you.
No, I don't. Yeah, no. The pathfinding is minis games is wildly dull to me. It's like
Mm.
block movement. I don't. It's like the pathfinding of like skirmish or character style minis. I just can't. I don't care. I just don't care. I want you to pick a point and just go there. I cannot be doing with it.
Mm.
Whereas I'm much more interested in the things about like obviously from the things we've been working on about how you get shoved and moved in sort of less like under your control and free ways. That I find much more interesting. And the sort of the controls you can put on how I'm allowed to move you, or how when I move randomly it affects you, rather than, you know, when you've got a character or a skirmishing thing, and it can clearly get from this point to that point, but we've got to go through the malarkey of doing it. I just can we skip to the good bit, please? Um, it's
Right. And I suppose like when that gets tense and interesting is like when in a game like Malifaux there were a lot of overlapping auras and like and threat zones, and so making the tactically correct decision about exactly where you put your base is like a knotty geometry problem in and of itself, and that is a particular kind of pleasure. It's not a pleasure for everyone, and it is not the thing that I look for in every game all of the time, but like, yeah.
The thing is, I think for me, it's one of those things where it's one of those puzzles that feels like this is 100% soluble if I just just
Mm.
grind my teeth for like 15 minutes. There is not a person in the world who couldn't figure this out. It's just, this is just a question of who can be asked to figure it out.
Maybe if the decision if the activity is to try and find the right spot, but if the activity is making a set of compromises because there is no perfect like
Mm,
there is no perfect spot, but you have to decide like who you're going to take, like
yeah.
passive attack bubbles in A Billion Suns is a bit like this. It's like, well, I'm probably going to have to like the ranges have been designed so that you almost certainly have to weather some passive fire. The question is, where are you going to take the risk? What are you going to decide on? And the question is more interesting in Malifaux because the answers are more dense, which is like whose debuff am I going to be okay to accept so that I'm not in the like active attack range of this other model that I'm more worried about.
But essentially, it's like I kind of sometimes want to play like Malifaux totally in the abstract. I want to play boardless Malifaux, like
Yeah.
they do with chess, where you just get two people sat opposite each other telling each other their moves. That's
Yeah.
kind of how I want to play Malifaux. I don't
Right.
want to.
Without the sort of inaccurate and inconsistent and frankly unhelpful physical reality of the game.
Yeah, that if I sit down and get on my tape measure, I can find a certain place where X, Y, and Z are true. I want X, Y, and Z to be true. Can we just accept that I have found that spot? And then,
Ah,
and
yes.
now what will you do
The
in this?
the Malifaux of pure logic.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's such a rarefied and lovely game, but it is this point where it's just like, I just want to be able to tell you what it is that I'm going to do. I don't want to have to physically like engage with doing it because it's so important that I do it. And
I
I
love it. This is actually the most Glenn thing I've ever heard in my life.
because it's like the best games I've ever played are where like at various points somebody has gone, oh, by the way, you're not in cover there, but I knew you could have been in cover.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Would you like to just say that you were in cover? Yeah, I would like to. Yep, fair enough. Okay, you were in cover. Those moments where you just go, I know what you meant to do there, and you are fully capable of doing it. I'm just going to point out you haven't done it, but I'll say you have because we're all grown-ups
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and we can just move on. That guy is not within that distance of that guy, but let's pretend he is
Yeah.
because you
Yeah,
you
because we
you know
know we
you
could have
can
got
do
there.
that.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to make you. And I like the idea, I would rather it was just all the whole game were just like that all of the time.
I mean, I think with War Rocket, what's interesting is that like it's a spaceship game, and spaceship games are very, very commonly spaceship games are experimenting with movement mechanics because, like, at their heart, like movement in space is different to the movement that we're used to in the normal world around us. And so people are interested in that and like building, inertial movement and, movement where I can face one direction and travel in another, and movement where I have to, I start moving in a direction, but it's difficult to stop moving in that direction. Like all of that stuff is interesting. And like, it's sort of really hard to like make sort of the actual kind of like changing your vector by firing jets, but continue like all of it's a little bit complicated to do on the tabletop, so lots of people have tried different things. And I think if I had to guess, like the designer of War Rocket has played a bunch of different spaceship games and gone, well, these are all nice and I'd like them all. None of them are exactly perfect. And hey, what if we just try and make a game with lots of these movement mechanics in? But it's fun because, like as we were saying there, like movement in spaceship games is kind of pure and abstract anyway, because it's basically just moving across blank graph paper.
Yeah, and I think like two of the game types that I think are very interested in movement, like space and sea based.
Age of Sail, yeah.
Yeah, Age of Sail, or whether it's modern battleships, they're still very interested in like inertia and movement, both of which tend to not have terrain or have very little or defined terrain.
Mm.
And occasionally when you get like air based, like planes dogfighting and whatnot. And I think like those games are have to be very interested in like the inertia and the weird things you can do with the movement, because there's no terrain to make movement crunchy. There's no like things that can block line of sight.
Maybe. I mean, like the games of Adeptus Titanicus that I've played, like I'm delighted by the movement restrictions in that game because they they communicate like the heaviness of the objects. And
Mm,
so they're doing a job in telling the story mechanically. Like one of the things about movement in that game is that you can move by basically by I think I'm right in remembering that like you've got a front sort of 90-degree firing arc, and you can sort of point the tape measure anywhere within that front 90 degrees, and without pivoting the model that allows you to kind of side slip diagonally, so you
mm.
can move forward but you can also sort of slip off to the side. And that one rule itself creates such a world of physicality that like I'm just immediately seeing the way that mechs move in the Mech Warrior video games. Like they're facing this way and they're walking that way, and it's like it's really cool that with a simple movement rule like that you can communicate sort of weight and the way that it, yeah, and the
Yeah,
sort of
no,
tank
yeah,
turret maneuverability of them and stuff.
absolutely. And I think it's the thing that's like eternally attractive about rank and flank games to people who like rank and flank games is that no, you have to wheel. You are a
Yeah.
block of 20 men, and if you lose formation, that'll be more fatal to you than any
Yeah, and the
will be.
movement rules are what tells that story almost more than anything else. Like you can have, as we have done, you can have a square of cardboard, but if it moves like that, it is sort of cinematically communicating itself.
And it's very interesting. Like for me, I think it's very interesting. Warhammer Fantasy Battle, there was a point where Dark Elf Hydras moved as skirmishers because they had like their little handlers, and the handlers were skirmishers, and the Hydra was like an attachment to the unit. And so you had this massive monster who could just pass through woods without being slowed down because skirmishers weren't slowed down, and had a 360-degree line of sight and could pivot and charge in a way that no other monster anywhere in the game could. And it was annoying because it was overpowered, but it was far, far more upsetting because it was ridiculous. It was wrong that that monster could just charge clean through, just run through a forest without being slowed in any way, shape, or form, and could apparently like spin on a dime and go the other way. It's the offensiveness of the fact that it's a movement that does not fit with the cinema of the way the thing should be working.
Yeah, and so like I've been playing some Warhammer 40,000 10th edition because because I want to understand it. I don't enjoy the game, but one of the things that's particularly jarring about it is the way that tanks are moved in the games that I have played, which is there is a specific rule which is basically every unit in 40k, at least up until I think this last errata, it basically just moves like a free pivoting unit where the specifics is no part of the model can travel more than its total movement distance. So if I have a tank pointing in that direction and I want to sort of be 6 inches behind me and facing in the other direction, then I have to sort of measure that furthest distance that the front turret moved from one place to another. But what it means is that like some of the games that I've played, and I am not certain if they played it exactly right, but like the prevailing wind was sort of, well, tanks are just like this thing that you sort of pick up and you plop down here and it you spin it to whatever. And it's like dragging an icon around on a desktop more than it is driving a tank across a battlefield. And so the lack of the movement rules in the at least that core book that I was playing from, like it just made tanks seem kind of silly and not heavy.
Yeah, I think it's like, I don't know, but Fancy Battle always had this thing with chariots, and like when they did the steam tank, there was a few times an attempt to make a steam tank have to pivot, and they just went, it's just a chariot, so all chariots can just pivot on the spot and just yoinking off in the other direction. And
Right.
very early versions of Warhammer Fancy Battle made an attempt to go. No, of course it. And so there were and I've seen various attempts to make chariots work. And there was a version of Warhammer Fantasy Battle where your chariot had to like take an arc of movement and go around and travel in certain ways. And I imagine that there are like versions of tanks that have done that at various points in 40k, and clearly they've just gone.
Yeah, I mean back in second edition, I think like tanks and people moved very differently.
Yeah, and I guess they've just gone, this is not worth the work and the effort. And also, I guess,
Well, and so with the most recent errata, they've decided actually it is no, actually it is worth the work. And so now 40k as of a couple of days ago, like people move. Actually, to be more exact, things on round bases move specifically like that. Things that are on oval bases or on no bases at all move by like only moving in straight lines, and then they can spend 2 inches to pivot on the spot, and then they move forward 2 inches.
okay, well, that's been an excellent conversation about movement rules. Uh,
Uh,
Mixing and matching different forms of movement in games is, I think, really interesting and really fascinating, and where the rubber meets the road between two units that sort of playing in different ways is a really like fascinating crunchy thing. But it is risky, and it
mm.
does definitely have like costs to it in complexity budget and rules budget, in sheer weirdness of what your players often have to engage with. um I'm sure everybody watching this video has played a game with some movement rules, and probably played a game with two different sorts of movement that did this at some point. If so, I would love them to swing down to the comment section, tell us about that game, tell us about how those two movement systems interlock to each other. Was it satisfying? Was it frustrating? Was it cinematic? Was it disappointing? All those things and more. While you're swinging down to that comment section, please, as you pass, you'll see a like and subscribe button go through as you scroll. Just tick tick as you go past it. That'd be lovely. Also, just down there's a set of links through to the Discord, where people will chat endlessly to you about the movement systems in miniatures games, with joy and delight in their hearts as they do so. There are our various websites and such like where you can swing by and buy the stuff what we make, which would make us very filled with joy in our hearts. There's even Mike's Patreon, where you can swing by and give him cash, not only for doing this, but for putting out games and things. And recently his game Space Gits, which has some very interesting movement mechanics and systems within it. So give him money for that. Give us all money for all sorts of things. Say hello to us in the comments in the Discord. But for now, from this conversation, this rule of carnage, it'll be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and bye bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.